Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's so nice to see you. Happy Halloween. My name is Sarah Rafson. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs here at the Harvard GSD. And on behalf of my team, which includes Raquel Rivera and Matt Smith, we're thrilled to welcome you to tonight's lecture and exhibition opening with Bas Smetes. Welcome to those of you who are in the theater and to those of you who are watching through the live stream, maybe with one ear as you're trick-or-treating. Wherever you are, it's important to remember that we're on land whose histories of stewardship and justice need to be acknowledged. We invite you to reflect on how foregrounding the stories and perspectives of Indigenous inhabitants shifts your understanding of and obligations to the people around you. We want to acknowledge the Harvard University Native American program's continuous work building relationships within and beyond the university to keep these perspectives at the forefront. So thank you. And also a quick reminder that we have live captioning available to those of you who are here with us and those who are tuning in virtually. If you're virtual, you can enable the closed captioning through a button underneath the live stream window. And for those of you here in the theater, that is the QR code that will enable the feature for you. If you have any questions, Matt in the AV booth will be happy to help. But I also want to take a moment to let you know about two exciting events that are coming up at the GSD. This Thursday, November 7th, we're hosting the distinguished landscape architect, Lori Olin, who was the former chair of landscape department here at the GSD. He'll discuss the stages of influence and reflection that precede and shape subsequent creative activity in his work. And after that, on Tuesday, November 12th, Sheila O'Donnell, founding director of the Dublin-based O'Donnell and Tuomi Architects, will describe her process of designing buildings from the ground up and the inside out. So find out more about those events and others that are free and open to the public. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to welcome the chair of the landscape department, Gary Hilderbrand, who will introduce tonight's lecture. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Happy Halloween. Sorry you're missing Trick or Treat. But welcome to this event, and it's wonderful to have a packed house 2 nights this week. Thanks to you, Sarah, and thanks always to Raquel and Matt and the entire events staff. You did all that twice for us this week. And special thanks to Dan Borelli here tonight and his amazing team of preparators who helped design, coordinate, and build this show in a pretty quick turnaround. And a beautiful outcome. Thanks also to Romina Totaro and other colleagues in Brussels at Bureau Bas Smetes for the wonderful expose out in the Drucker Gallery. Just over 3 weeks ago, I found myself sitting in the mayor's office in Athens, Greece, watching a team of 11 GSD students present a climate and environmental assessment of Athens to 3 deputy mayors and their staffs. Pretty brave. After the presentation and discussions, one of the mayors toured the students through a parking garage in an abandoned building to a roof where they could get a good view of the low but varied and dense skyline of the city. There they were able to observe the distinct lack of tree canopy, which is one of the conditions that makes Athens one of the hottest cities on the planet. And of course this year, the hottest summer ever. 2 of the deputy mayors later that evening came to a presentation by the head of the studio, professor in practice Bas Smetes, and now they're really keen to understand what Bas calls biospheric urbanism. And they're very keen to take up the results of the student work, and there will be a trip in January to make that happen. The beautiful exhibition that we celebrate tonight was made possible by the Daniel Urban Kiley Exhibition Fund in Landscape Architecture. While much of the exhibition focuses on recent and current work of Bureau Bas Smetes, it also includes the work of our students for the first 2 of the 5 planned studios Bas will teach on changing microclimates in cities. I can attest that the student work in Paris, at least, has been well received. I was on a Zoom call in May this year when students presented to 4 ministers of the cabinet of Mayor Hidalgo. And the reactions were like all the emojis coming up on the screen. And then comments that were just palpably favorable for the work, the reception of the work. So the entire series of this studios is generously supported by the Luma Foundation's generous gift of the Landscape and Ecology Series, Research Series Fund. We are enormously grateful to Luma for an amazing and inspiring partnership. Of the leading landscape architects practicing today, Bas Smetes may be the one who has most seriously faced up to climate adaptation and resilience in cities through the work of his firm. I think I lost a page. Hold on. Sorry. Yep. Here it is. When Bas gave the Daniel Urban Kiley lecture here in Piper Auditorium in the spring of 2022, on the evening of the announcement of his appointment to the faculty as professor in practice of landscape architecture, he began his lecture by reading from the UN's IPCC's 6th annual climate assessment report, which had dropped, I think, just a couple of days before the talk. The news wasn't good. It's gotten worse. It's 78 degrees on Halloween. I doubt if that's ever happened before. I think as things proceed in this way, our winter will begin in February. And we all need to see urgency in this. Bas brings to the GSD a radically aware and urgent sensibility around adaptation of urban environments towards improved public health futures. He does it through the inventive use of primary tools of landscape architecture while collaborating with a broad array of experts in evidence-based modes of conceiving and building. Bas has spoken about his appointment in the school as a means to pursue topics and investigations and design discourses that his commissions may not always provide. But I have to quickly say that in the gallery, you can observe a striking reciprocity between the teaching, that is to say, the student work, and the work of the firm. And this is, to me, exemplary of professor in practice. Each of the projects is part of an interrelated research into the experience of the city, in part as an assemblage of altered networks of microclimate conditions. He says it's an imbrication of climate conditions. That's what the city is made of. So when the students map the city, they are mapping the climate of the city. Urbanization and building alters climate, something that was first observed in London in the early 19th century and is by now urgently aware to everybody on the planet. In 2022, the entire design world took notice as Bas, a non-Parisian, won the design competition of the decade, the adaptation of the Ile de la Cité after the catastrophic fire of 2019 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. He'll talk about this tonight, along with Luma Parc des Ateliers, again, the supporters of this series, and also the beautiful work in Antwerp. In all three of these projects, as you'll see, there's an unbending commitment to landscape performance. Again, the reciprocity between what's above the ground and what's below, between the conditions of the atmosphere and the vital measures of human comfort. But my own interest in this work, more specifically, is that while performance is as high, the expectation on performance is as high as it can be, the spatial and experiential qualities of the work don't diminish from that. That's really, really important in this work. In fact, they gain. And I would say maybe that's a thesis in the work. Higher performance, but also more spatial beauty. The work is spatially sophisticated as it is performative, we could say it that way. And the world I want to live in doesn't privilege one of those over the other. Bas has a background in civil engineering, architecture, and landscape architecture. He founded the firm in 2007. He's completed more than 50 projects internationally now with his team of 25 architects, landscape architects, and urban designers. We're very proud to celebrate this work and to hear from Bas. After his talk, design critic Alex Wall, who's joined us tonight, will come on stage with Bas and me for brief discussion and hopefully some questions and answers. Congratulations on the exhibition, your US debut in exhibitions, and please welcome Bas Smetes.
There are some seats down here in these first few rows if people want to come down and work standing by all means.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Gary, for the introduction. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, GSD, for my debut of an exhibition here in the Gund Hall. When I was asked to do an exhibition, I immediately knew I would call it Changing Climates. Changing climates to speak about the climates that are changing, but also to speak about ways to change the climates ourselves, to make microclimates. And when we were asked to make an exhibition in the Gund Hall, I knew that I wanted to make atmospheres, microclimates, if you like, in that hall. And I thought, is this a building? Is this a climate? Is this a landscape? Is it maybe a landscape that mistakenly thinks it's a building? And so, as we always do, we started reading the existing situation. And we thought maybe those columns are part of a kind of hidden forest that holds the building. And maybe the walls are contour lines. Maybe someday a river was passing through. And maybe the perpendicular walls are obstacles that allow the building to have doors. And so we were looking at this space, this hall, and how do you make an exhibition in a hall? It's quite an interesting question. And we noticed that there was a kind of a meander of that river, and so a kind of a center. And from that reading, we thought maybe we can use that center to place our 3 large-scale models that you have seen when you walked in, find a space to project photographs that our photographer Michiele Kleene has been taking for the last 10 years, use the other walls for the necessary information, and then make a connection from these projects to the research by this 70 feet long wall where we project the surface temperature, and then again using the trees, pardon me, the columns, to frame the student work on Paris and on New York. And so in a sense, the whole build-up of the exhibition for us was yet another landscape, yet another climate that we wanted to insert in its context, in this case, a context of a building. This to show you how, for us, everything is landscape. And it was Maya Hoffman that once told me, "Pour toi, tout est paysage." And so I'd like to walk you through both the research and the projects that we show here, and to show you how indeed everything is landscape. The first case study we did was on New York City, and more precisely on Manhattan. And I had asked the students to work as a group, as a real studio, and to do a reading of the existing situation, going through the former tributaries, looking at flood risks today, at stormwater flood to understand that those are directly linked to the tributaries, looking at green space, but also at street trees, and even at possible roof drops. And so really mapping and mapping and mapping at the scale of the city, at the urban scale, to come up with a new type of cartography. And in the Dan Kiley lecture I gave last year, I showed you the von Humboldt design. So we're looking for a new way of showing and revealing this information that we extract from those readings. And those readings are physical, but also meteorological. So also the wind, also the surface temperature, also the quality of the air. And so this led us to these beautiful drawings that show everything except for the building. We make abstraction of the building to show how the built reality produces a multitude of microclimates. And for each of these microclimates, we can look at a similar situation in nature to learn from that situation and bring the logics of nature into the artificial second nature. And that's what we did with the students who chose their own site. And for me, it's important that the students choose a site based on the problems they reveal. And I'll show you 3 of those projects between the 12 beautiful projects that had been made as an illustration of how I try to think with the students in a different way. So, for example, here, Ji-Young Bak looked at porticos, well, actually scaffolding, and she noticed that the temporary scaffolding of New York today is 1/3 of Central Park. Why is that? Well, she discovered that today it's cheaper to pay the penalties to keep the scaffolding in place because you need to verify the quality of your facade every 10 years. It's cheaper to pay the penalty than to dismount and remount. And so she thought, and I thought it was a beautiful idea, to give a tax reduction or a penalty reduction if the scaffolding becomes a green roof, of course, creating a better outer comfort and bringing more biodiversity into the city. 1/3 of Central Park for free. And so I really encourage them to hack into the system and find ways of greening the city without cost. And so she did that in a beautiful way. In a similar way, Austin's son looked at POPs. POPs are privately owned public spaces. And you might remember in the 60s, a law was voted in New York where you could build higher if you made public space. And in that law, and I think it's 76, if I remember well, it was written you had to plant 4 trees. And so Austin said 4, why 4? So he thought, and thanks to Transolar, with who we've been working on all these studios, he thought, let's measure UTCI instead of number of trees. UTCI is the Universal Thermal Climate Index. So he thought by simply adding to that law that the UTCI should be lowered by X degrees, you could suddenly create a network of POPs. And here he showed that for a part in Midtown, and all the blue trees are the new trees that would be the result of this law. So again, hacking into the system to produce better public space. And the third project by Parama Suteja was, he called it resurfacing Mannahatta, and he found out that Manhattan comes from Mannahatta, which means island of many hills. And so he looked at building heights, and he thought, well, actually, we still have the hills. I mean, Manhattan has been flattened. We still have the hills, but they are on buildings. And so he thought, can we make a new hybrid landscape of green roofs, and based on typology and weight, creating this kind of new green mountains on the hill of Manhattan. So 3 examples of how, through the reading, through a new way of looking at the built space, a new way of looking at reality as a possibility for nature, for a new type of nature, how these students perfectly hacked into the system. And along the way, we make beautiful drawings, not because they're beautiful, but they're beautiful because of their clarity. I believe in clarity of a drawing. A clear drawing is always beautiful. The next case study we did in Paris. I'll run you through it. So again, the reading, the topography, we discovered that Haussmann's boulevards are mainly parallel to the contour lines of the valley of the Seine, except for a couple that are perpendicular. We discovered that the runoff from Montmartre, which you see on the top here, that creates flooding along the Seine, could actually perfectly be, that water could be perfectly recuperated by these parallel avenues. And so suddenly you have a system to reduce flood risk at the scale of the territory. We showed it to the city representatives that hadn't seen that at that scale. We looked at and so suddenly you could have these boulevards that are cooled down by the runoff, by the evapotranspiration of the trees that would create corridors from the Bois de Boulogne to the Bois de Vincennes. We looked at all the open spaces, cemeteries, squares, plaza, everything not built. We looked at parking lots. We looked at all the public buildings that also could become part of a way to battle heat. We looked at the underground, from the car parks to the metro lines to the quarries, and then we made this map, which I really like, the map of possibilities. This is the map of all the combined elements that we think we can hack into, and I'll show you what the students did with a couple of examples. Again, they chose their own sites, but here, since Paris is made up by typologies, we looked at changing those typologies, and we looked at a way of organizing the kind of a dramatic future that lies in front of us, and you can see it on the wall. We looked at what to do at 2 degrees more, 2025, what to do at 3 degrees more, 2050, what to do at 4 degrees more, 2075, and what to do at 5 degrees more, 2100. And so in a very pragmatic way, we come up with the proposals. Here, for example, 2 degrees more, I mean, we're at 1.3 right now. We should use those boulevards made by Haussmann, and this first group showed it. By taking out space for traffic, we can make bioswales. We can store all that rainwater running off from the hill of Montmartre, using it to feed those trees to create evapotranspiration and making a microclimate. The city was very positive towards that, because that's exactly what Hidalgo has been doing, reducing space for cars and creating more space for pedestrians, bicycles, but also vegetation. So 2 examples of that. If we go to 3 degrees, the group working on 3 degrees thought about what to do with open spaces, both gardens, roundabouts, or plazas. And for example, Roxanne Garner looked at the l'Esplanade des Invalides, one of those sacred spaces for the French. And she found out that the lawns are not possible anymore. When it's too hot, you're not allowed to water them, and so they die out. So she thought, why not use the grid of the trees that border those lawns, create an arboretum with trees that are climatically resistant to the drought, and to suddenly frame Les Invalides, this famous view, within a park-like structure that can be used instead of a lawn that cannot be maintained. We had an interview with Le Parisien, and this became the cover of the journal. And so, in a very interesting ways, with the students, we're allowed to try these things out. Like, I could not do this not while working on Notre Dame, but because it's student work, we can really test new ideas. Then we go to 4 degrees, and it's also based on what the city of Paris is already thinking of doing, is opening up schools to deliver water to neighborhoods that have problems with the heat islands. And so here, 3 students looked at different types of public buildings. And I will show you the work of Slide Kelly for the Pantheon, another of those sacred monuments, surrounded by hardscape, surrounded by facades, so really heating up in summer. And he looked at the plan of the Pantheon as if it was indeed forest in stone, and continued that with forest of trees surrounding the beautiful footprint of the Pantheon. And then at 5 degrees, the group really took it very seriously and thought, okay, if it's 5 degrees, I mean, we're looking at 50 degrees Celsius in the summer, we need to go create refuge underground, a bit what Houston is already doing today. And Crane Saris looked at parking lots, and he thought, actually, parking lots are a great structure, because, of course, you create shade. And he looked at another one of those great places, Place Vendôme. And he thought, if I make a big opening around the obelisk, if I take out a couple of floors, I can bring back the idea of flâner, of walking around on the boulevards in Paris and in the parks of Paris, but in a better temperature in a more shaded place than in the scorching sun outside. And so here he made these beautiful images of the Place Vendôme become this kind of temporary and contemporary grotto. And the last student looked at all the quarries, the former quarries of Paris, how they're interconnected, and how they could become a place to spend the day when it's too hot, how you could ventilate it. She also looked at how it was used in the past, for example, to grow les champignons de Paris, the mushrooms of Paris. And so she came up with these beautiful images, and she even used La Jetée on the bottom left to think of the drama of the 5 degrees also as an opportunity to produce new types of landscapes, new types of architecture. And here we looked at the possibilities of 2 degrees with the streets and the avenues, 3 degrees the open spaces, 4 degrees the public buildings, and 5 degrees the underground, to again make a kind of blue map of possible interventions to make the city ready for the challenges of climate change. That research is projected on a white wall right next to the black wall where we show our projects. And just to give you an idea of what we have been doing these last 15 years, I asked Michiel de Kleene, who has been following our works for the last 10 years, and the idea is that he doesn't take the right picture at the opening, as you would maybe do for a building, but he goes back to the site. So he takes pictures every time he's there, in summer, in winter. And so he made a selection of 106 pictures of 50 projects organized by month. So you go from January to February, from winter to spring, to summer, and to autumn. And so these play in a loop as a kind of showing the possibilities of change. Next to that, we show 3 large-scale models. I'll walk you through them because we don't try to explain the whole project, but we try to explain the climatic approach. And so each of these 3 models, each of these 3 projects responds to a different challenge of climate change. In Notre Dame, specifically the heat islands, you may remember from the past, if you would wait for 3 hours to go into the cathedral, you'd have a headache. Well, they expect 15 million visitors after the opening, end of this year. And of course, the climate is not getting any colder. And so here, from a precise reading of the site, even redrawing the trees at the same height, at the same width that they have, we proposed a scheme where every one of those typologies, from the parvis to the placette, to the square, the gardens, to the street with its alignments, and the embankment along the Seine, we rethink each of these very strong typologies in a climatic way. So we try to bring the past with us and make it ready for the future. And this idea of working in these typologies allowed us to have each of these elements progress within the theme of climate, if you understand what I mean. So we could think, okay, we can plant some more trees on the north side of a cathedral because that's in the continuity of the trees that are there. We can rethink the plaza as a continuation of the inside of the cathedral. We can think the embankment as a continuation of the trees along the Seine. So suddenly we would concentrate on the typology and make it part of a whole. I'll show you a couple of pictures. This is so the parvis becomes a clearing. It's not just a plaza, it's a clearing surrounded by trees that provide shade. And so these 15 million people, before going inside, can profit from this shade and the evapotranspiration of the trees. Along the Seine, we planted 150 more trees to create shade again, to also cool down help cool down the wind that comes from the Seine and that goes all the way to the plaza, but also at the tip where you have this beautiful memorial by Pinguisson. We take out the parking places that were there. We plant new trees. We make the lawns bigger, and we invite people to really do the walk around the cathedral, not only be in front, but walk around. And then on the plaza itself, and that's shown on the model as well, we invented this idea of adding a thin layer of water, and my daughter here will show you, that will run down to the cathedral and will create evaporative cooling. So it will not cool down the stones, but it will cool down the air through evaporation, about 5 to 10 degrees, depending on the wind. And so on the model, what we've tried to do is to show how the UTCI, the perceived temperature today, will become worse around 2050. As you see that it's becoming dark red, so you create all these heat islands, especially in front of the cathedral, where we're obliged to keep an open space, but also in the back. And here you see that through the trees, through the water layer, through the wind from the sand that passes through, we can work on the perceived temperature. More about this water layer, the idea is to store the rainwater in the former parking lot that will become a visitor center, and on hot days, we can pump the water and create that layer, 5 millimeter really, to create that evaporative cooling. In Antwerp, we were faced with a different climatic challenge, that of sea level rise. Antwerp, which was really the center of international commerce in the 16th century, was developed along the Scheldt. And in white, you see an ambitious project to make inland harbors. These were made, and the idea was to build many more all the way down south. But then came the Spanish invasion. All the engineers fled to the north and built Amsterdam. But what's interesting is that, and I didn't notice before doing the competition, that in the city fabric you still see the width of these canals. They have become what we call vlieten. And so I thought, if we have to make a new wall that cuts the city from the river, because the wall is 2.2 meters high, so 7 feet high, I thought, can we not keep a relationship between the city and the river where these inland harbors that you see here below used to be? And so we decided to make retaining walls along those former canals that allow you to create a landscape in between, and that landscape holds back the water, as you see here, instead of having a retaining wall along the embankment. And so here we made a sequence of these park structures, and then the mobile walls that can close off the connection with the city. Together with the engineers in our group, we looked then at different ways of making retaining walls from using the earth as a wall, using the mobile doors, using the steps, a whole typology of walls to avoid, again, a 400-meter long wall cutting the city from its river. Here you see how these walls here create the connection with the city. Also came the question to make a memorial for the 25,000 people that died in World War II, and we use the history of the city to commemorate its victims. Because we have this lawn that builds up 7 feet high, you have a beautiful view on the left bank. And so from the existing situation you see here, we come to this proposal. And here too on the model, we try to show the different levels of the water. I'll show that here. So you see the former canals that correspond with the width of the streets existing today. The water that used to flow into the city. There was another element, is that there's a lot of archaeology on this site dating back to the 15th century. The only place we could dig out was where the former canals were, because everything was dug out there. So anywhere else we go up, we higher up, so we're not digging anything. So that also worked beautifully together. Then here you see the water in a normal situation. Our new seawall made up of these retaining walls, this earth, and here you see the mobile walls closing down. And so when the storm hits, you get this hybrid retention wall along the Scheldt. And from this, I come to the third project dealing with climate change. Arles, France, where the Luma Foundation built its headquarters and its center for the production and the exhibition of art, and where Maya Hoffman asked me to transform this sterile wasteland into a park. And here too, this is 10 years ago, the first question that came to my mind was, I can only make a park if I change the climate. And to change the climate, we did a lot of studies that I won't be showing you today, but the idea really was, what would nature do in 100, 200, 300 years' time, and how can we accelerate that process? How can we use the force of nature to have it come back to the city? And so we looked at wind, how wind would bring sediments, how sediments would create environments, and how trees and shrubs and ground covers would find root in those environments. The topography is modeled by the wind, and this produces an asymmetrical section where in the summer you can lie on the soft slope in the shade, benefiting from the breeze, while in the winter you can be in the sun, benefiting from the cold wind cut by the topography and the vegetation. And so in function of the amount of earth that we added, we go into a next ecological succession. And I always say this, but when you walk in the park and you see the mound build up and you see a pine tree, you've not gone into the past, but you've gone faster into the future. You are 300 years later. And so from the existing industrial wasteland, you see this at Plantation. This is a drone shot made by Iwan Bane. He took another one just last summer, where you see how all the trees have started growing. So here you see really tree by tree how we planted them, and here you see how they become an ecology. Well, this is built, so I can show you a couple of pictures. So everything you see we planted 80,000 trees and shrubs, one by one. And this I wanted to show on the model, because here the other models were made to win the competition. This model we made afterwards, and I asked the model makers to plant every tree exactly where it had been planted. We designed all the trees in AutoCAD. They were printed in 3D, so a pine tree looks like a pine tree, an oak looks like an oak. It's totally crazy, but I think it's the most precise landscape model we've ever made. Here you see the topography being made, accelerated by the wind. And then, and you'll see it better on the model, we show you the plantation of all those trees and all those shrubs. And so you see the list on the left. But you see again on the model is exactly what we built on site in Arles. And so these trees, and Transolar is here. We worked with Transolar on the UTCI, and we lowered the temperature, the perceived temperature, by 20 degrees in summer. 20 degrees because of the evapotranspiration, because of the evaporation of the lake, because of the changed radiation. And so I think this is the best example that, yes, we can make microclimates. I'm coming towards the end. In front of those three models, you see a strange wall with these strange signs, and this for me is a very important part of my practice. They're called sigil, which is an official word, and which means a magical sign. And this was developed when I was making the film for Philippe Parreno, French artist, and we had this whole discussion about the magic a sigil can do. And the idea is, and it's a beautiful idea, is that if you reduce a desire to its minimum and its most concentrated form, and you keep that form in your head, it will become true. That's the magic theory. And so what we do here is, for each of the projects, we try to summarize, but it's never a scheme. It's always based on real physical reality. Like every form is a real form. But it is the desire of a land to become a landscape. And it's a desire of a landscape to produce a climate. And so each of these projects that are on the wall, 84 of them, have been built or are under construction. So each of them corresponds to a project and to a territory, and are again the promise of a possibility to make microclimates. And I end with this wall, probably the biggest or longest render of the surface temperature projected by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Gary mentioned it, was made March 2023. And so we start from 1850, we go to 1900, 1950, 2000, and we end with 2100. And when you see the graph in the book, you say, yeah, it's getting redder. When you walk those 70 feet, I mean, you feel the heat. Or I hope you feel the heat. And so I want to end with this blood red image with a double idea. Yes, it's really dramatic, and yes, we have to be 100% aware of where we're going. I mean, Valencia, I think there's enough examples. And at the same time, I hope the exhibition brings a message of hope, especially in a place like the Graduate School of Design, where through design we can make proposals, we can change microclimates, we can bring hope to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Bas. A brief but thorough tour of the student work and also the work of the firm. I want to make two very short points. I want to remake these 2 points. First is, I think you must be persuaded about the reciprocity between the teaching and the practice. That is a long tradition in this school, and we are able to fully embrace that tradition when we hire professors in practice like Bas. Thank you for your contributions to our tradition of the reciprocity between teaching and practice. And then there's the urgency of the blood red map, and Valencia yesterday. Vermont twice this year. Upland conditions, right? Inland rivers. Full of cars running downstream, like this. I've asked Alex Wall to offer some remarks and perhaps pose questions. Alex, I mentioned, is design critic in landscape architecture. He also is the domain head of the MDes domain called ecologies. It'll help you to know, if you're not aware, that Alex has been an amazing urbanist for 40 years, honing his early knowledge in offices of OMA in Amsterdam and Athens. And it'll also help you to know that he teaches a seminar called Thinking Landscapes, Making Cities, which is about how landscapes can be regenerative. And I think we have proved tonight that we're learning how to do that. Alex.
Thank you. I have a colleague in Norway at the AHO who teaches a course called Thinking Cities, Making Landscapes, dealing as those cities are surrounded by landscapes. I'm very exhilarated by your work and the exhibition of your work looking at the Dan Kiley lecture of 23, again yesterday, but today particularly because, and thank you for showing us the work that the students are making. This is a terrific collaboration. And I'm exhilarated because I'm looking at fragments of a better future, and not just individual landscape projects, but public spaces and landscape as a conditioner, the public spaces of the city as the air conditioner for a city. So I have a question, and that is, these fragments, your individual projects, are part of what city? And the city, I imagine, is structured around the needs of regional and local ecosystems. Before urban development takes place, the status and the needs of the watershed, the urban forest, ecosystems, as I said, have to be established, including the needs of living things to flourish, reproduce, and migrate. Then we will know where to build. And I'm wondering if this kind of city, which to me is, thank you, which to me is an outcome, is a possibility of your projects. Your projects are showing me fragments of this city. If this city might come into being as a coherent, planned settlement form, or is it something that we just have to make in fragments as conditions change and our skills change? It's a city where urbanization decisions are made together with decisions about regional landscape and ecosystems, not as two different systems, but as one unified system.
I think if I call the studio biospheric urbanism,
Yeah.
is that I believe in the combination of urbanism and biospheres. And instead of making cities extracted from the biosphere, cities can produce new biospheres. And so for me, this biospheric urbanism is the idea of making biospheres with urbanism. And so it's not something that's planned, but it's something that's made. I think we are now in the moment that we should make things, continue making things better, and we don't have the time to do the big planning and to then implement. So I was always intrigued by constant, this idea of a city that's constantly made, where you move while you're making it. I think today we should, and that's why I always ask my students I like the idea of hacking into the logic, that you make a small change that then produces many results. So I believe more in kind of a way of hacking into the system that then disrupts it, changes it, than a planned city. But I do think that whereas whereas cities were cut out of the forest, because everywhere where there's a city now there was a forest, of course, at some point. We have to come to a new urban ecology. We have to understand a city like a second nature, like a possibility to introduce nature, plants, animals, and to find a new equilibrium between plants, animals, and the space that we need.
It strikes me that this way of thinking is rooted in disturbance ecology. So 30 years ago, when the ecologists were on the other side of the table telling us why our projects weren't going to work, the science of disturbance ecology sort of changed the picture. And around 2000, that's only 25 years ago, the ecologists moved over to the other side of the table, and they were on the design team. And now you can't have a design team without ecology. And I think what you're saying is that through, let's say, fragmentary disturbances, we can add up. We can add up to a changed biosphere.
Yes, and it's a bit the power of 10. Those work at all the levels. They work at the level of the city, but also at the level of the planet. I think if it's a bit of a naive idea, but if all the cities become these urban ecologies, we are making many microclimates. It's not going to solve the microclimatic problem, but those microclimates can help at least create an enhanced outdoor space. And we see the difference in Arle. We see the difference in these projects where suddenly, by thinking public space as a climate, we can easily change it. And I mean, there's many studies that prove if you live in a a street with trees or a street without trees, it changes the number of days you live. I mean, it's so evident. So I think rethinking the city as a possibility to make biospheres, to make landscapes, to make climates, can drastically change the way we deal with cities.
So of the 3 projects in the gallery, the one that proves your method is Parc des Ateliers. It makes me wonder about, now that you are in the first phase of construction, preparing for the opening in December in Paris, does the project still completely resemble the work you presented in the competition? Or has the city caused you to alter the project for any number of reasons?
I would say it's exactly the same and it's totally different. The ideas are exactly the same, but everything has moved a little bit. But compared to the competition, if I show you the competition or the project now, it's almost the same. The biggest difference is maybe that we will keep a fence around the garden to the east. That in the beginning the city wanted to take out. Now we're putting it back, but that's not a change in design.
So the climate map stays the same?
It stays totally the same. We have tested. They were a bit nervous about our idea of this thin layer of water, which I understand because it's never been done at that scale. So we've made a mock-up of about 4 by 5 meters. So we had the water run down. We proved that you could be in nice shoes and not get them wet. So we've developed it more. And what we're building right now is the first 20 meters really in front of the cathedral that will be inaugurated together with the cathedral reopened on December 8th. And then we start building in summer next year. But again, all the trees might have moved a bit. We did a lot of diagnostic racinaire, what do you call it, roots diagnosis of the existing trees to make sure that we were not touching the big plane trees that are there. So everything has been a bit calibrated, but it stays
for
the same.
the critical root zones.
Exactly.
Amongst very varied architects, the concept of the urban living room and the idea that many of the activities in the home could take place if designed in the open spaces of the city. And I'm thinking of your project, you didn't show it this evening, on the Gulf, where you were connecting historic buildings, and you observed there were these empty lots. So there were a series of rooms along those paths. Rooms could be programmed, and as outdoor spaces, they become conditioners in the way that you use planting and water, and that they might also be, there's a suggestion that it's more than a matter of comfort, but also of security for the city, that in cities that suffer from hurricanes or tornadoes, as well as heat, there can be safe rooms, indoor spaces associated with these, so that the life of the city begins to become oriented towards the outdoor spaces and the functions that are attached to them. That's another thing that emerges from your work, which I find terrifically stimulating.
And you're now revisiting the great essay by Alex Wall, Activating the Urban Surface, which motivated a lot of people. You know that work.
Yeah, and I think, and I didn't show one of the projects in Manhattan was about floodings. And so when we discovered that all the subway stations that lie where the former tributaries were flood, I mean, it's so logical, but we forget these maps, that one of these students came up with a solution for that flooding. And then if you make it for one subway station, you can make it for all 200. So this idea of repetition, which we also did in Bahrain, that we made together with Kirsten and David, where once we had designed one, we made 17 of them. So this idea, and I think, and that's also a reason that I came teaching here, is we don't have time to do competition for all of these public spaces that we want to design. We have to find ways of, again, hacking into the system and just come up with solutions that can be implemented fast. I mean, we're still in the dark red, I think. This, by the way, is the intermediate projection. I want it to be like neutral, but probably will not even hit intermediate. We'll go to the high one. So we have to, I mean, as a group of architects and landscape architects and urban planners, I think we have to find ways to convince governments and public authorities to implement these changes now. You know, we have to find a way to, because the system doesn't work like that. In Europe, you have to do a competition. I mean, and I'm not against competitions, but the thing is just it's too slow. We have to find a way of doing it faster.
And you know, this is the third lecture this week that has spoken about buried rivers and the people who are in harm's way who live on top of those buried rivers. Bob Zimmerman lectured in our Core 1 studio about this, and he's really on it. Ann Spurn lectured on that topic on Tuesday night in this room, and you showed it in Manhattan. And I guess we're just going to be constantly talking about it because this is harm's way. But I loved that you ended on an optimistic note. So, I mean, the show does give us hope.
We have the moral obligation to be optimistic.
Love it. On that note, let's see if there are audience questions. I see one or two. And please wait for the mic. Looks like we have a thoughtful and responsive audience tonight.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I was impressed by the pursuit of precision and exactitude in terms of, tree planting or height. And in my mind, trees, microclimates, everything is actually changing at every moment. So, how do you sort of work with things that are always changing, like wind or temperatures, versus your desire, but your pursuit of exactitude at every sort of moment in time?
The precision allows a more precise answer. For example, in Arles, it was very difficult to plant those first trees because you were planting them in a semi-desert. And so we had to calculate how many trees we needed to plant, how much water we need to give the first year, the second year, the third year. So the fact that we measured and calculated everything allowed us to take risks that I would not have taken 10 years ago without that knowledge. So in that sense, or there's other projects, Bahrain, but also Trinity in Paris, is that the fact that we can know more precisely the reality today and to project the reality with the project allows us to take those risks. So the exactitude lies in better understanding what's there now and what it might become.
Hi, Bas. Thank you so much for your great presentation. I really like your slide style. It's very clear. So I was actually amazed a lot by your passion to insert as many parks as possible in the city, like on the scaffolding, on the rooftop, between buildings, whatever. So my question is actually specifically related to the Notre Dame program. Because we know that you won the public space design around Notre Dame. And we all know that a few years ago, disaster happened to Notre Dame, and also a competition followed by, and a lot of very famous designers designed for Notre Dame, reconstruction and renovation. I wonder, how do you feel about those ideas with introduce rooftops to the Notre Dame, or a glass house on the top of the Notre Dame, all of those crazy ideas? I wonder what's your opinions about those projects?
What I thought was very interesting as a response from the design community is that they kind of invented a competition that didn't exist. It was in a competition on Instagram with all these famous designers suddenly coming up with ideas, and even people thought it was a competition. It was never a competition. But I really thought it was beautiful that everybody wanted to come up with an idea. The fact that the state, the French state, decided to rebuild Notre Dame as it was after Viollet-le-Duc. It's up for debate, but I also understand why they did that. In a sense, the fact that was rebuilt gave us more liberty to rethink the space around it. It's a very interesting question, but of course, from my point of view, I concentrate less on the building than on the landscape around it. And what we were trying to do, and I think so far successfully in Paris, is to rethink that monument in a new setting, which is already very, let's say, it's a big step already to allow the fact that you will see or you will experience Notre Dame in a very different way now than it was before the fire. And I think, and also the work we did with the students in Paris, all these monuments could become opportunities to rethink the way we live them, the way we experience them. They could become, because they always have a lot of space around them. And so each of these monuments could become a way of rethinking the city. Again, if you do it for Notre Dame, there's 10 others that I can think of that can follow. So in that sense, and even if Notre Dame is so iconic, it's always rethinking all the city in one space.
Bas, I very much enjoyed the talk, as I knew I would, and I loved how the different studio projects show how the micro adds up to essentially a macro. This sort of builds on what Alex was saying, in terms of, and that is something that you then are able to talk to different mayors about how that macro vision is imperative. So I think that agenda is really fantastic to see. My question is about the technical, sort of the Parvis, the water on the Parvis is a kind of technical invention that you're putting in and you had to prove with the mock-up. A lot of what you're showing seems to be relying on the use of nature through intelligence. If this is how nature wants to be through the wind, this is how the forces would lead to a better climate if you let them be and if you built them in that way. And so to what extent, how often do you rely on the technical to do what you're doing to change climate? And how often are you really sort of relying on natural know-how, let's say?
I totally trust in natural intelligence. We all speak about AI, but I believe in NI. And I use technology to better understand natural intelligence. So I don't rely on the technology per se, but I rely on technology to better understand natural intelligence. And so, for example, in Arles, when we put sensors, we have, for every 10 trees, we have one witness tree, as I call them, where we put 3 sensors to measure the humidity of the soil, is to know where the roots are. I cannot ask the tree, but I can know through humidity tension where the roots are, so I can know how to water that tree better. So in that sense, I don't think it's not a technological solution. It's technology to better understand natural intelligence.
Natural intelligence is kind of a beautiful idea, and I have to think now of the amazing book of 2016 by Amitav Ghosh, The Great Derangement, which told us that we were victims of our own demise. Because he says that the Descartesian binary, which arrogates intelligence to humans only, and not the rest of the beings on the planet, has essentially for 400 years, 350 years, got us where we are today. And he says the Earth is coming back to us. The natural intelligence is backlash.
Yeah, and I can assure you, life will survive. Maybe not us.
Maybe not in the
but
maybe not in the
survive.
form we know it. More questions?
Thank you, Bas, again for your lecture. Here. I have a question about water. So all of your projects are heavily relying on water and use water as a way of creating greenery spaces and more cool spaces. So I wonder, since we're not just getting hotter every day, we're also running out of water. what are your thoughts about a responsible way of using water, but at the same time creating green spaces, and how can we find that sweet spot between those two?
It's a very good question. The only thing we need is water, because earth you can bring, plants you can bring, water you cannot bring. I mean, we just need too much of it. And so what we're doing in all our projects, but also with the students on the Athens projects that are up there, is looking at how, because there is water, and we won't have, precipitation is not going to go down significantly. We'll have more water on fewer days, ask Spain. And so the idea is, how can you capture that water and keep it for the year to come? And think of a city is a perfect place to capture water. All the roofs are waterproof, all the hardscapes are waterproof. It's a perfect receptacle to capture water. Except what do we do? All our cities are built to get rid of the water as soon as possible, creating today floodings down slope. So you have to rethink a city. I mean, sponge city is a word for it. You have to rethink the city as a way to keep water on site. And for example, in Brussels now we have a plan for public spaces that was just voted now, where we say the first 2 meters from the facade is for services, the next 2 meters is for water, soil, and trees. And so you have to rethink every street as a dry valley. Every street becomes a way to store water and to bring that water through evaporation of the trees back into the atmosphere. It's very simple what needs to be done, but we have to find these solutions that are then implemented. It's almost beyond design in a sense. But what I'm interested in, because of course I think a lot about the aesthetical part of it. If you think of Haussmann, which has this rigor, I mean, they could bulldoze everything and then just make their perfect plan. We live in a kind of post reality, and I think if we start implementing these kind of ideas, it'll produce a new aesthetic, the aesthetic of opportunism, the aesthetic of necessity, and I would be very interested in seeing what that aesthetic would produce.
Thank you for your lecture. I really appreciated it. Kind of what Mr. Hilderbrand touched on. We talk about digital fluency as something that younger generations are living with and coming into spaces of education or the professional workspace with, and how that changes just the world. In terms of landscape architecture or urbanism and things like that, you opened your practice around the time that Mr. Hilderbrand referenced there being a shift in the ecologists being on the designer side of things. Have you noticed, or to what extent have you noticed, a change in students' perspectives or designers coming into your firm having not learned about climate change necessarily in higher education, but as growing up with it as a fact of life?
Because I think the new generation is more, we had to learn it, because when we grew up, it wasn't a thing. I think the new generation is very, very much aware. And I think what I'm trying to do here with the studio is to see climate change as an opportunity to make projects. I mean, we cannot be stifled at the perspective of our red wall, you know. So it should become an ambition or an incentive to move even faster.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It's incredibly inspiring to hear you speak, and very motivating, I think. My question to you is about the treatment of the built environment, particularly in the Notre Dame project, but also in your students' work with the Pantheon, as this precious to be preserved piece of the environment and the landscape. And particularly, I'm interested in the aging infrastructure of the United States, and we're rebuilding it, we're renovating it. I want to hear your opinions and your thoughts on treating the built environment, our infrastructure, as precious, and how landscape can kind of start to take over the aging infrastructure, the aging built environment that we have, and maybe take up more area in our cities.
Well, in continuing what I said earlier, if we have to redo the sewer system, for example, because in most old cities it's still a combined sewer system, which is totally insane. The first thing we need to do is really think of all the rainwater falling on those roofs, not bringing them into a sewer system, but storing it underneath the sidewalks. Again, it's not so difficult. Honestly, it's not even that expensive compared to making a new building. Landscape is cheap. That's a good thing about landscape. So we should find this kind of 10 things we need to do. And then when we start doing it, it can change rapidly. So I think the whole infrastructure should be rethought, and we should bring NI in there. It's not only about us trying to solve everything. We've been so much concentrated on the engineering part that we forgot to use the force of nature. And so again, that rainwater into an artificial aquifer that feeds trees, that works perfectly. And you don't have flooding, and you have trees. So I think rethinking the whole way a city works through the lens of NI will give us enormous opportunities.
So we're the people standing in the way of your next experience of NI, which is wine and cheese. That's natural intelligence. We'll take one more question.
Well, it totally is, huh?
It is.
Wine is made by grapes and cheese by milk, so that's a perfect NI.
Hi, Bas. Thank you for the presentation and for the projects. And I had a question that was partially answered by your answer to Dean Whiting's question. I was thinking, I mean, you showed these projects, and of course, I don't know all of your projects, but I wonder whether you will consider, or have you done any landscaping projects where there is more active or productive landscapes instead of those, nice places where we can look at, and then occupy and then play in. But, what about, say, urban farming, like things that are directly, literally more productive? Were you avoiding these because these were not truly natural intelligence, because you have to, artificially control them, and you are not letting nature do its own thing, or it's less effective as a means to create, a microclimate?
I've not been avoiding them, but I've been really, the mission of the office from the beginning, very clearly in my head, was to make public space. So we've mostly responded to public commissions, to public competitions, and we've not come across urban farming that way. At some point, I would like to look into it and see how that can also produce public space, in a sense. But so far, it's not come across the path of the office.
Thanks to the audience for really good questions and beautiful responses to Bas's talk. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Bas, for the grace that comes with this amazing exhibition, and thanks for your talk tonight.